Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Certified Forgotten. We are back on a cadence that's really exciting for Donato and I. We're actually delivering episodes every 2 weeks as promised. So thank you for tuning in. Hopefully, you've enjoyed what we've been doing for the last little bit. And this week, we're going to introduce him in just a second, but we've got a great episode with a guest that we've been circling for a very, very long time. And we were able to find time on the schedule to talk about a movie that I wasn't expecting him to bring, but that's okay. We'll talk about it in a minute. I want to check in at the top of this episode with my good friend and co-host, Matthew Donato. How are you doing, Donato? I hear you're moving.
Yeah, we're working on it. It is just living in LA and rents being ridiculous and trying to navigate the fact that someone can raise your rent 12% in a single year when you think, hey, maybe we can get a few years out of this apartment on regular, normal rent increases. And why would that happen? So we're having some fun.
Would you describe your rent as being too damn high?
Yes.
Excellent.
As much as I don't want to be a meme, it is legitimate.
Here at Certified Forgotten, we only bring you the best in decade-old memes, so you're very, very welcome.
And like, of course, I just saw Evil Dead Rise, and you see this beautiful apartment that they complain about, or they talk about like not paying that much for, and I'm like, where does that exist? Can we get the Evil Dead Rise discount, where the Necronomicon discount? I'll deal with the fucking book. I don't care.
What would the price point for that apartment have to be for you to live with Deadites? Are we talking like 700? Are we talking like 500? Where do you make that trade off?
Wait, am I living with the temptation of reading the book, or are there actual Deadites as roommates?
You are living in, sorry, to our guests, we need to figure this out really quickly.
Yeah.
You are living in like one of the neighboring apartments, and
Okay.
there is a chance that your neighbors could come home one day and be possessed.
Oh, like probably like 2,000.
Okay,
If you get a two,
much higher than I was expecting.
Yeah, you get a 2-bedroom in LA down to $2,000, split that rent. Yeah, I'm good.
Great. Jesus, that's bleak as fuck. Donato, why don't you introduce our guest today?
Anyway, getting back to the actual topic at hand. As Mr. Mongol said, we are bringing on someone that I have known for a very long time, shared some Fantastic Fest housing with. No Deadites, just us, which is bad enough. We don't need Deadites in that house. We are bringing in a film critic for Screen Anarchy, an Oscar-winning producer for Potentate Films, and programming consultant at Fantastic Fest itself, Mr. Josh Hurtado. Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
I can't believe that all three of those things are just one person. Josh, that's incredible.
It's been a very busy year. But yeah, I will say, just slight correction, it's a theatrical consultant and distribution on the distribution team with Triple R. Yeah. So there we go.
Okay. Well, Josh, to start the episode off, we'll talk about like your history and career, blah, blah, blah. Same question to you. What would the discount on the high rise need to be for you to consider actually living, let's say New York, Chicago, where you might need to move to?
I mean, I don't know. You and I are used to Texas rents, and that number that Donato just threw out kind of threw us for a loop. I would say under $1,000. Under $1,000, rents have gone up pretty significantly here in the last few years in Texas even, and under $1,000, I'd deal with that.
Okay. So, hey, look, in a decade's time, Evil Dead Rise is going to be considered quite the commentary on housing prices, and that's going to be an affordable. It's just going to be something you're going to have TikTok real estate influencers that are basically like, we do have, the Necronomicon that sometimes kills some folks, but that's just sort of a quirk of the property, really. Oh, I could have the entire episode about that conversation. But Josh, I want to start by talking about you. So as we always do with our guests, the first question we like to ask is sort of the earliest connection to the horror genre. And I know that strictly speaking, some of the people that we bring on the show are like horror and only horror. And I know that your interests and your skills as both a writer, a programmer, a person in the industry are much more expansive than that. But for the sake of this, I'd like to kind of talk about, when did you first find yourself connecting with the horror genre specifically?
I was a bit of a late bloomer, which, having listened to a lot of your guests, is a fairly common story. I was terrified of horror movies when I was a kid, very young. My very first horror-related memory is of reading The Monster at the End of This Book, the Sesame Street book, and being just absolutely riddled with anxiety. And, it took me a while. One of my earliest memories of a horror film, and this is embarrassing, but I've told the story a bunch anyway, so I might as well get it out here. Was my father, who loved movies of all kinds and didn't really show me horror movies, but he thought, on a lark, that he would show me when I was 7 years old, Plan 9 from Outer Space, the Ed Wood film, thinking, this is hilarious. My 7-year-old is going to see how poorly made this film is, and we'll both have a great laugh. I had nightmares for weeks. I
Mm.
built myself a little Lego gun that I took to bed with me, just in case the vampires came to my house. And that put me off for a very long time. He also showed me RoboCop way too early. So that was a thing. I was, I think I was 7 when RoboCop came out, and he brought home the tape from the video rental place. And as soon as the ED-209 shoots that guy up in the boardroom, scarred, just absolutely scarred for years after that. And my connection to horror, where it became something that I craved, didn't happen until after I was probably 10 or 11 years old. I started reading Stephen King books. That was, it was before Goosebumps. I didn't really read kids' books very often, or YA stuff. I went straight for Stephen King because the books were everywhere. I mean, you could find them. Everybody had them. There were billions of copies. My parents had copies of the book, so I would just go and read, The Stand on a lark or whatever. So that's where it really started. And then I think this was also part of your story as well, Monica, was my first light bulb moment for horror was seeing Evil Dead 2.
Yep.
That's the one that really flipped the switch. It's like, oh, I'm getting adrenaline. This is making me happy. I want more of this. And that was probably around 13 or so, when I was 13.
Yeah, I think I've talked about this on the show before, but I remember, I think for me, there was always sort of the tension of anticipating bad things happening to somebody was always the thing that scared me about it. I remember being at the library as a kid and flipping through. I don't know why the library had this, but they had an illustrated collection. It was an illustrated history of Tales from the Crypt, the comic book series Tales from the Crypt. And so I remember reading at the age of 8, I was flipping through this cover, and each cover, if you remember your old Tales from the Crypt issues, it's always somebody at the point of death, right? It's somebody in a tank of water about to drown, or somebody being pulled underground. And those were such traumatizing formative experiences for me, because what scared me about horror was this notion of being forced to watch as something terrible was happening to somebody. And you're absolutely right. Evil Dead sort of unlocked it, because it was the first time that I watched something that was using the filmic elements of horror, but it was funny, and bad things were happening, but they weren't they weren't punishing things. They were just these silly, gross things that were happening to folks. So yeah, I always love it when I hear somebody else resonate on the Evil Dead 2, because for me, it was always, I needed the horror to not be so personal. I didn't need to watch somebody die. I just needed to watch somebody. It was okay if they died, then they become a monster, and I'm all right, now we're having a good time.
Yeah, and that the horror comedy thing really resonates with me, and I know that it's not for everyone, and they're the hardcore horror heads who are adamantly opposed to comedy in their horror. I've never been one of those folks. I'm pretty forgiving of them, actually. It doesn't take much to entertain me. And so following that, I just went to, the local video stores and started renting up everything with a cool cover. And it was I think it was actually around that same time that I started to go see horror films in the theater. When I was young, I had a mustache when I was 12. So I could go to R-rated movies, no problem. So I would just go to see whatever. I went to see, Bram Stoker's Dracula when it came out in the theater. From Dusk Till Dawn I think that was around the time I was 16 or 17. And, just went nuts on stuff. And it was by that point, when I was probably about a sophomore, junior in high school, was when the internet was starting to become a thing that most people had. So that would have been about 95, 96. It was a very crude version of the internet. So much so that I was a webmaster. I learned HTML in order to put my stamp on the world. But what I did find was that there were a lot of people who were writing about horror movies back then. I couldn't afford Fangoria. I didn't couldn't afford it until I was an adult, and was able to subscribe when I was probably 20. Um, but there were all these lists online. 50 most disturbing films, all this kind of stuff. At the beginning of the internet, there was the notorious website rotten.com, which was just all pictures of the most horrible, vile things. And I was just curious. I just wanted to see, like, what does somebody with elephantiasis of the balls look like? Like, I wanted to see all of the things that the internet had to offer. And it was going through those lists of like most disturbing films that I was like, oh, I can handle this. It was a slingshot. I'd been pulled so far in the direction of being scared of these things, and then realizing that they can't hurt me, that I just went nuts.
I like that aspect because, as you know, you have the draw to Monocle with Evil Dead 2 and stuff like that in the horror comedies, which I do share as well. The late bloomer thing is something that I've always been a little self-conscious of as a horror fan, because in my mind, every other horror fan and like every other horror fan you talk to is, oh, I had the brothers and sisters that showed me everything under the sun by the time I was 4 or 5, and like they had the base level just laid down by either parents or somebody else. And it's been nice in doing the podcast and hearing stories like yours that do align with mine of like waiting and not getting there till a little later in life. It's just really, it's so funny to hear though that like it still took me a little bit longer, and I did not have that kind of, I guess courage. I said that curiosity until probably like college. But to go back really briefly to what terrified you, playing 9 from Outer Space and all that stuff. Attack of the Killer Tomatoes was on at like a family friend's house, and I was very young. And of course, it's a comedy. Of course, it's not a straightforward horror movie. And that was one of the ones too, like same reaction. Like they put it on, like, oh, haha, the kids will enjoy it. And I was like, turn this the fuck off. Like, absolutely not. Like, I was like, I have to leave.
Yeah, I mean, and what's funny is that my wife is the kid that grew up watching horror movies way too young, and watching all the Nightmare movies and Friday the 13th movies with her parents when she was like 4 and 5 years old. And she explained it to me in the way that because a lot of the reasons that kids, well, I won't say kids, I'll say me, a lot of the reason that I wasn't watching those movies, or that my parents wouldn't rent them even for themselves, was that there was a lot of nudity in them. And they weren't incredibly scared of sexuality or anything. It was just like, I don't want to watch boobs on the couch with my kid. I'm dealing with that now, as a father. But I guess my wife says that like her parents weren't that concerned with that aspect of it, because she's going to have boobs. Like, my wife is going to have boobs. So what's the problem with her seeing boobs? And so she was just off to the races. And part of one of the fun parts about our relationship over the last 10 years is I'm getting caught up on all the stuff I missed when I was a kid that she watched, and so it's always a joy when I'm able to introduce her to something from a time where she would have been watching those films that I've seen first, because I feel like I won a prize, like I finally got one. This happened with the Stepfather just last weekend. She had never seen the Stepfather. And I was just so excited to show it to her. But yeah, it's been sort of for me since those early days, and finding the internet and finding all these lists, it's been like a race to the furthest edges of cinema for me. Trying to get out and find just the wildest shit I possibly can, and that's a lot of that wild shit happens in horror movies. And so that's one of the things that draws me to them, because that's a lot of where the creativity is.
And I know that a lot of people that are familiar with your criticism, familiar certainly with your work in the industry, probably know you best as a South Asian expert, as somebody who follows South Asian cinema trends, knows personally a lot of filmmakers, a lot of talent that are coming out of that part of the world. And I'm kind of curious how that and horror, because starting with like film at a young age, I think for especially for a lot of people, embracing international cinema, embracing non-English language cinema is something that comes later. It's such a big hurdle because it just feels so far and different from it's not what your friends are talking about. Like, for most of us, we're not in middle school and people are like, yo, did you see P2 or whatever? Like, I can't believe that movie. So I'm curious how you began to sort of focus and specialize in South Asian cinema, in addition to what you were discovering on your own here domestically.
Well, it grew out of that same curiosity, and the sort of looking at trying to look under rocks, for films. And what I realized was, just like a lot of people who are my age, but a few years older than you guys, not much. Um, a lot of people my age sort of came up when Hong Kong cinema, Korean cinema, Japanese cinema were starting to make marks in the States. Korean, especially in the early 2000s with Old Boy and JSA and things like that. And so I was watching all those things as often as I could. And, Asian cinema in particular was very interesting for me. Um, and then one day I just kind of realized, like, I've seen films from Indonesia and the Philippines and South Korea and Hong Kong and all these places, and I've never seen an Indian film. Like, it seems odd. It's a huge country. Everybody knows that India makes movies. Like, everyone has their own preconceived notions of what Indian movies are. And I was like, well, why don't I just give it a shot? And the first one I actually saw was after reading an article on the site that I have written for a while before I was with them, about an Indian remake of Old Boy called Zinda. So I was like, cool, I can rent it through Netflix. They'll send me a disc. I'll see it. And that one didn't really make a mark. It's a sort of, it's pretty generic remake, instead of 15 days, it's 14 days. There's like a lot of little tiny things to get around legal concerns. But then like a couple years later, I decided to give it another shot and just absolutely fell in love. One of the first films that I saw was a movie called Om Shanti Om by a director named Farah Khan, which is just this big, boisterous musical, revenge, action, everything film. It's very, very colorful. The acting is huge, and I know you guys have seen Triple R now, so you kind of get the vibe that things are from India aspire to in some cases. And this is what we call a masala film. It's a very big multi-genre film. Um, and I've watched it and I fell in love, and I was like, I need to watch more movies like this. And so I started to, rent up what I could from Netflix, because, back then DVDs were pretty easy to find. And Netflix's DVD catalog was a lot deeper than their streaming catalog ever was. And so I did that for a few years. And then I, at some point in the next couple of years, realized that I can go see these films in theaters here, because this would have been in 2008, 2009. And where I live in Dallas there's a huge Indian population, and it's always been serviced by, ethnic theaters, by Indian theaters here. I just didn't know they were there until 2008. And so I started going to see the movies in theaters. And then I was like, still curious. And I can't remember why I did this, but I ended up going into an Indian grocer for something. I probably just needed to get a Coke or whatever to finish my day out. And the Indian grocer had rentals. They had like a big wall of rentals. And I was like, oh, I didn't know this was a thing. Like, I didn't know I could go and rent Indian movies in Indian grocers. And then came to realize that every Indian grocer had these rentals, because India is a film crazy country. And it's one of the things that they're, even as they move far away from their homeland, they have this connection to home. And so, I would just go in there. I wouldn't rent, because, I mean, if you guys on the podcast can't see it, but behind me there's a big shelf of discs. I have a lot of discs. So I would just buy things, because they would sell them for whatever, $4 or $5 for a DVD. I would read the back of the cover and see if it looked fine, and just went nuts. And so after watching, a couple hundred of them over the course of a few years, I started to understand this world and wonder why nobody else was paying any attention to it. And so that, led into my writing with Screen Anarchy, or Twitch Film at the time. It led into the work with Fantastic Fest, and eventually is led here to the work with Potentate Films and SS Rajamouli.
So is the through line then, as I'm kind of thinking about our conversation about horror and about Indian cinema, you mentioned masala film, which thankfully is a term that I was taught in school. I had a very, very good international cinema professor who spent, really, it was a day. It's not enough, but a day on Indian cinema. Is maximalist cinema kind of the through line there for you when you're talking about, like, purveying the corners of the internet, seeing things that are because Masala's musicals and action sequences and dance numbers, it's the most. It's RRR is the purest distillation of what Americans would think of as Masala cinema. Is so horror, Indian cinema, is it the notion of like all of these like incredibly filmic, incredibly maximalist things?
That's certainly a draw for me. I like when people take big swings, whether they're working with a couple $100 or $72 million like they were with Triple R. Big swings are always going to win points in my book, even if they don't necessarily land. Um, when it comes to horror in India, there had been, and I'm still fairly new at like going backwards in Indian film, just because there's so much of it releasing every year.
Hmm.
If you don't know, India releases somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,800 films a year, and that's across dozens of languages. It's a huge industry, and so it's intimidating to try and like dip your toe in. But in the 80s, India had a pretty, I wouldn't say successful, but a horror industry that was consistently churning out mostly B grade films, and it had kind of died out. In recent years, there's not a ton of horror, but even the stuff that there is sometimes can be in that same masala vein. So, for example, there's a film called Street, which is a horror comedy that came out a couple of years ago. It was quite good. There's another one. It's part of a trilogy. I forget the middle one, but there's I don't know, the last one was called Bedia, which is another. I think they're just kind of thematically linked. I don't think they're actually like a proper trilogy.
Hmm.
But they do. They have songs and dances. They have lots of comedy. All that kind of stuff goes in there. There's not a whole lot of straight horror because that's just not in, the Indian film industry's, DNA for the most part. When it does happen, like something like Tumbad, which we did at Fantastic Fest a few years ago, that was great. But even then, you have in that movie uh, cool looking monsters. There's a rubber monster at the very beginning, like the grandmother rubber monster thing. That's it's very much a throwback to the '80s style. Um, One of my favorite films, which was I almost made you guys watch it for this, but it's 2 hours and 45 minutes, so I decided to have pity on you. Is called Kanchana, which is a it's a comedy horror action musical about a transgendered reincarnated ghost possessing uh, one of India's best dancers. It's a pretty special thing, and I've shown it to a couple of people, and you either love it or you absolutely hate it, but you can't forget it. When we did the 2016 Indian sidebar at Fantastic Fest, I couldn't get that film to play. I would have loved it to put that in front of an audience, but I did manage to get one of the songs. Like the very first song in the film is a song called Nilla Nilla, which is it's a this guy. His name is Lawrence. Is the choreographer, writer, actor, producer, like multi hyphenate, and he's an amazing dancer. But he has this crew of dancers that he brings with him to every film that are all disabled folks. So you're looking at it, and it's just like, what is happening? But it's just so amazing to see, something new. Like I said, big swings. He's swinging for the fences, and that movie has that. It has romantic numbers. It has people being beheaded. It has this transgender ghost. It's surprisingly progressive considering it's a film from India from 2011 that deals with trans rights essentially at a time before we were dealing with trans rights
Hmm.
in any substantive way. Um, and so having those big swings, it's one of the things that really draws me to India, because you can do that in a mainstream setting there, and that film was actually really successful. And if you watch it, it is completely insane that a film that does all the things that film does was significantly successful.
Well, I think, and like that's why we talk about international cinema so much, and I think that's why we talk about trying things and trying new types of movies because, American studios, as much as you have the Fast and Furiouses, and like yes, people do take swings here. I don't want to like say, oh, American cinema is just boilerplate down to the same template now across the board. But in the same breath, like yeah, when you do see one of those Masala movies, it is a wholly new experience. Like there is a reason why RRR took off, and there's a reason why we keep going to those. And like mentioning Tumbad, like I love that movie so much, and I saw it at Fantastic Fest that year. And it's always a little frustrating though because like with distribution rights internationally are such a mess, and of course, like this better than anyone, being on the distro side in a certain sense. But yeah, like I'll be like, oh, Tumbad, like everyone has to see this movie, and then I'm like, cool, when's it actually coming out? Then like a year goes by, and it's like, cool, this hasn't come out yet. I'll keep recommending it, but I don't know when it's going to hit. And then it just drops on like this one specifically dropped on Amazon Prime without any fanfare, and it just kind of existed there. Like it's hard, it's that hard battle of like you have no idea. Like this movie is so good, like the cinematography could have won, like it should have been like nominated for an Oscar that year, but it does that route. It doesn't get the big distro. It doesn't get the big push, and then it goes to Amazon Prime. And every, rightfully in a certain sense, every American is like, well, it can't be that good if it didn't get a distribution and just ended up on a
Mhm.
streamer. And yeah, like that is the frustrating part of it.
With India in particular, it's very challenging because, like I said, the films, for the most part, any major blockbuster or big budget movie coming out of India is going to release in American cinemas. It did 15 years ago when I started to go see them. It does that reach has greatly expanded over the last 5 years, where every AMC, every Cinemark, every Regal has at least one or two screens dedicated to Indian films, and so there's and this is what we did with Triple R. Is when Triple R released, it released in March of last year. I went to see it. Obviously, a few other folks that I'd sort of prepped for the filmmaker went to see it because I've been working with a filmmaker since I programmed his film Iga at Fantastic Fest in 2013, and having shown that film, people sort of picked up this name, and then so we had a few people who went to go see it based on kind of having seen Iga and then having seen his next two films, the Bahubali films, and then going to see Triple R because they know that Rajamouli is a person they want to go see a film from, but they don't advertise. So that's what we did. Like we did marketing, and that's one thing that Indian films have never done. I would say really, but they have never done marketing outside of their core audience, or even outside of India proper. So you won't see trailers for Indian films in front of mainstream American films in general. You won't see ads in papers or banner ads or any of that kind of stuff that you would see for any other film, because they do all that stuff in India, and all the people that live here who are going to see those films, Indian immigrants that are living out here, they just follow those news. They follow those trailers, and so they know what's coming, but nobody else does. And with Tumbad, for example, Tumbad didn't release in theaters in the U.S. It released in theaters a couple of weeks after we showed it at Fantastic Fest in India, and then, like you said, it went to Amazon Prime. Jallikattu, same thing. Jallikattu we showed in what was that, 2019, and that film played in theaters a couple of weeks after we showed it at Fantastic Fest. Almost nobody knew it was there. It went to Amazon Prime again, and with that one, I was trying very hard to, I've been working trying to get that filmmaker's work seen outside of his core audience for, by that point, it had been 4 or 5 years, because I'd seen a bunch of his earlier stuff, and I was like, this guy's going to be something. Like he's gonna do something that people are going to love. Jallikattu is not even my favorite film of his. It's great, but like, there's the problem is that someone like Lijo Pellicerie, who did Jallikattu, is a mainstream filmmaker in his part of India, and so the idea of his films going to festivals was somewhat foreign to everyone. And there was just an article that I was interviewed for that came out a couple of days ago about the challenge of sharing Indian films outside of India with a non-Indian audience because they're not viewed as festival films. Like Triple R, they don't view that as a festival film, and it didn't play at any festivals until we showed it at Beyond Fest, which happened 6 months after the release, which is nuts. And so,
Can you
yeah,
put
it's,
that, Josh? Can you put that into for folks that are visualizing that may not be as from? Can you name like an American, like if an American film were to play at like a regional film festival in India, like what is sort of the parallel or the like same kind of tier in terms of like blockbuster movies that aren't viewed as a festival film? What would you compare that to in terms of going the other way?
I mean, it would be like something like a Fast and the Furious movie or a Top Gun Maverick playing at a film festival in other parts of the world. You know, that kind of thing only happens really with something like Cannes. Cannes does big premieres every year. Like there's always some big movie where you're like, why is this playing at the Cannes Film Festival? You know, some new Pixar thing or whatever it might be.
Right.
But that's kind of like a one-off. It's a thing to like celebrate the premiere, and everyone gets to go and hang out in the sun, and it's wonderful and beautiful. Um, but I've been turned down a lot of times when I'm trying to program things because they're just like, why are you calling me? My movie already made $14 million or whatever it might be. Like I don't need you. And I'm like, well, I want to show people your movie, and it's a very frustrating position to be in a lot of the time.
Yeah, because it's like, why don't you want more dollars? You can have more dollars.
Exactly.
Then I want to wrap up this conversation. We can talk about the film, but I want to ask as sort of a temperature check. You know, I think a lot of people, New York Times, everybody was writing about RRR, Triple R. I like RRR better. I'm going to use that one as sort of a watershed film for Indian cinema in the United States. And do you feel like, as somebody who's been programming for a decade that has been working on this, do you feel like we're starting to catch up, or do you think that there's always going to be, you know, the the what is it, the 5-inch barrier, the 10-inch barrier, whatever? Do you think that there are just cultural differences that are going to prevent mainstream American audiences from ever regarding blockbusters in India as blockbusters here?
I mean, I think it's going to be a matter of gaining inches at a time. You know, in terms of like on a football in a football game. You know, we're not gonna get touchdowns every single time. I've said this. You know, Triple R is it's a unicorn. Like it is. It's a wonderful film that did exactly what it was supposed to do. People picked up on it, but it doesn't mean that that's going to be the same thing for every Indian film or even any other Indian film. Like we don't know what'll happen. Like there's, you know, the comparison has been made, and I think it's apt to something like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, 20 years ago, where it seemed like, oh well, now the world's ready for, you know, for this cinema, and then it wasn't. Like there have been a couple of minor things that have popped up, you know, like The Promise or things like that have happened over the last decade, but there hasn't been something of that magnitude since then coming out of there. And you know, I'm ready to fight for it. You know, I'm ready to go in and do some of the work. And you know, part of the thing is, like I said, there needs to be someone there to curate. There needs to be someone there to say, okay, well, there are 4 Indian films in your theater this week. Which one should you go see? Or
Yeah.
is there nothing in the cinema this week that's worth your time? You know, and that's part of the job of a programmer also. It's deciding and figuring out which of the films are going to work for an audience. There are things that I absolutely adore that I know would not work for Fantastic Fest, or I know would not work as a release for Potentate Films. It's about knowing your audience and understanding how the marketing works.
Well, I will plug you at the end of the show, but I want to plug you right now to say that if you don't follow Josh on social media, I've gotten some incredible recommended. Like Cargo is a film that I love to pieces. I only know that film because it got, you know, released into the quagmire of Netflix, you know, international releases, which means it might as well not be released at all. But I only know that one because you beat the drum about it, and specifically we're like, hey Matt, I know your taste. I think this is something you'd be into. So you should follow Josh. If the conversation we just had about Indian cinema is interesting to you, if you are like many of us that are like, I know a little, I'd like to learn more, I'd like to dive in a bit more, following you on social media is a good way to start because you do highlight what comes out. And especially if you live in Texas or other major metropolitan areas, there's a decent amount of Indian releases that are happening every week. And so the Cinemark down by me usually has 2 or 3 at any given time. So knowing what's worth for a normal moviegoer, knowing what's going to be accessible, approachable that you might want to follow up on, Josh is your guy, I think.
Well, thank you. I talk about them a lot. So.
And now for something completely different. We just had a really great conversation about the challenges of international film distribution. And we are going to pivot and talk about a piece of international cinema. and maximalist cinema. And I think those are probably the only two pieces I will carry over into our next conversation. So when we come back, it's time to talk about Father's Day. We'll be right back.
Oh, hello, Certified Forgotten listeners. It's bumper time, and it's me, Matt Donato, one of your co-hosts for Certified Forgotten. There is no monocle this week because I am editing this episode very late. I have a flight to Vegas in less than 2 hours, and I just got to read some bumpers off myself. Solo duties this time. Let's get to the questions. Please excuse me because I don't know who sent what bumper using the new Google Forms that we have, so I'm just going to read them off, and I think this first one is Ian. So if it is you, Ian, I apologize. If it is someone else, I also apologize. In any case, first question, what are you listening to at the moment? What new bands have got your interest? So me, Matt Donato, is listening to a lot of Electric Callboy right now. Just one of my favorite bands out there. It's best described as Eurovision party metal. I just saw Ailstorm in concert, so some pirate metal is in my mix right now. But newer stuff that has me excited is a band called Red Hook, a, let's say, harder alternative band that just, they rock hard. I don't know how else to say it. They're everything I want. They bring a lot of energy. They bring a lot of, like, modern takes, but still has that good alt-rock vibe. Another band, which is kind of on the sadder note because they just broke up this year, is Dollskin, which is really just a kick-ass punky girl band, and they put their last song out last month, so they are done for the moment. I really wish they kept going, but yeah, check out Dollskin. They are very good. Another band that I've listened to for a while is Enter Shikari, and they just have a new album out called A Kiss for the Whole World, and it is just, it's feel good metal and like feel good party metal, especially like that stuff you can put on and just like vibe with and just like reach a high. It's not like angry metal. So yeah, that's a lot of what's in my mix right now. Oh, and also the Dirty Nail. It's just like stuff I'd put on during a barbecue. So I really like the Dirty Nail right now, and they're releasing some new stuff. So check them out as well. Okay, and on to question number 2. I don't know who sent this as well. We're gonna figure this out for next time so I can give proper credit. But it is a wonderful question. If you could be on any reality series, which would you choose? I'd like to take a trip to Flavortown on Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives with Guy Fieri. Number one, I would too. I really need to say how much I love Guy Fieri, and I love like food shows and cooking shows myself. So honestly, Diners, Drives, and Dives would be on my list, but also out there is The Floor is Lava, and growing up as a huge Legends of the Hidden Temple fan, so this is like the next step for me now in my adulthood. Like I want to be on Floor is Lava so incredibly bad, and I know where they film too. So like I don't know. Maybe I'm just gonna like go to the studios one day when I hear they're filming the next season and see if I can get in. But I think those are my two. Or just put me on any cooking competition show where I can be a judge. Epic Mealtime used to have one on YouTube, and that would be my vibe so hard. Don't put me on one of like the hoity-toity ones. Put me on like an Epic Mealtime kind of food competition show where I can judge it. That's in my heart. That's where I want to be. But yeah, that is our bumper session for this episode, and let's get back to our wonderful discussion on, well, Father's Day.
Okay, welcome back. So, when we invited Josh on the show, I thought for sure, 100%, I thought for sure he was going to bring a piece of underseen international cinema to us. And technically, he did. He brought us Father's Day, which is the 2011 film by Canadian answer to Trauma Entertainment, I guess is what you call them, Astron 6. It is, we'll talk about that. That's what the guest is here for. Usually I write like an introduction, and it's smart and it details what happens in the film, and it gives you like a little bit of a taste but leaves you wanting more. I don't know, man. I don't know that there's any kind of introduction here that could do this justice. So I'll just say it's a revenge story. There's a character named Fuckman. Hell is involved. Lloyd Kaufman has a small role. yada yada yada. Let's leave it there. We're going to talk about the different elements of the story. It'll come out kind of in the wash, but let's start like we always do by asking our guest, Josh, all of these films that you could have brought. I don't think that this is at all an inappropriate certified forgotten title. I want to start there, but I was surprised that you picked this one instead of maybe something that again is more in line with the conversation we just had. So I'd love to know what made Father's Day the thing you wanted to bring to us.
I adore Astron 6. I was first exposed to them through Twitch Film, the site that I again write for. That's Screen Anarchy now. Before I was writing for them in 2008 with a trailer called Laser Ghosts 2: Return to Laser Cove, which is just this fantastic little fake trailer send up of sci-fi horror. And from there, I went on YouTube to find anything I could from them. And Father's Day is one that, as I was looking through the Rotten Tomatoes things, I had a few things that I was juggling, and I was looking through there, and they just made it. Father's Day just makes it for the criteria. And I was like, that's wild, because I remember when it came out, people talking about it a bit, like there was chatter. So why are there so few reviews on Rotten Tomatoes? And you've touched on this at different points in the podcast on previous shows, but I think it's just the state of Rotten Tomatoes and who they considered to be appropriate RT certified critics and outlets was very different in 2012. And so I think my review's on there from back then. But there weren't a lot. And I went on this morning just to sort of check and see, look at other reviews. And when I Googled reviews, it was all like teeny tiny blogs, not a whole lot of major outlets, apart from Variety. I think Variety has a review up. And I was just, it was this or Manborg. I think Manborg it's less horror. I think it probably still would have fit the podcast. But this is straight up horror. I think it's kind of a revenge thriller thing, but there's, like you said, they go to hell, and there's a lot of very gruesome things happening on screen, and I want to celebrate that. I want to celebrate Astron 6 with this repulsive, blatantly offensive, disgusting gem of a film.
So let me offer real quick, because I kind of did like the joking, like I don't know how to describe this lead in, but to the point of you bringing this, Josh, I want to note that there are a lot of filmmakers, distribution companies, whatever, that I feel like sort of capitalized on the grindhouse revival, right? Like Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, kind of engendering all this enthusiasm for like low budget 1980s style genre films, slashers, DIY, like, obvious fake dummies and fake body parts kind of things. I think there's a lot of people that sort of came up in that wave. And I would say, I joke about Astron 6 being Troma of the North, but I think that they have proven themselves to be a company that their creativity and versatility goes far beyond the boundaries of just like, oh, they are a grindhouse imitator. Because they made The Void, which is a film that I genuinely love. And I don't want to step on you here, Donato, but they made Psycho Gorman, which is at this point Matthew Donato's entire fucking personality. So they are a really fascinating, I guess, like a cooperative, a collection of filmmakers that move and work together. And I think that makes something like Father's Day, it's sort of like, yes, is it a grindhouse? Is it like playing in the same side of the pool as like all this other stuff? Is it exploitative, and is it like shocking for shock value? It is, but it's also more than that. And it's more than that, both in what we're looking at in the film, and it's also more than that in hindsight with like the entire overall body of work. Donato, you're nodding a lot right now. I know that I'm hitting on some points you feel very strongly about, so I want to let you kind of like weigh in on the Astron 6-ness of it all.
Yeah, I mean that's where I was gonna kind of go with it. Like, number one, to me, they feel a lot closer to 5-second films or a collective like that, where we know what Troma does and we know what Troma puts forth, and they have a very certain vibe. And if you watch the Manborgs and their other stuff outside of Father's Day, they feel more in tune with the satirical comedy aspects of, like, watching The Editor is a straight send up to Giallo and things of that nature, and a satire on it in the way that Dude Bro Party Massacre is a satire of the slasher genre and sorority slashers. So I feel like there's I feel like there's a little more intelligence into what they do that is not as well shown in Father's Day, let's say. I think their stuff is a little better elsewhere for that reason. But that's not to say, like, this is Monica, you just said, like, this collective went on to do things. And I think they disbanded before they did The Void, like disbanded, quote unquote, like to say they weren't Astron Sticks. Like that was Steven Kazansky doing The Void. That was him doing Psycho Gorman and bringing obviously like Adam Brooks and the people that he knows along, because why wouldn't you bring your friends along for the ride? So, but no, I adore what they do in the guerrilla filmmaking, just the going out and making insane maximalist minimal budget films and seeing their vision through all the way. Like you can tell how they got from something like Manborg to Psycho Gorman. Like you can tell the story the whole way because those effects are always so cool going through. They just do practical themselves. So I am this is always my kind of movie. Like I'm still into Father's Day. Don't get me wrong. Like what they're doing is very much what they're doing, but also like touching on the Rotten Tomatoes aspect of it too. Like Josh was talking about, it's most critics not only were going to ignore horror at the time, but most critics were going to ignore minimal budget, like literally zero budget kind of films. And as much as I might have, as much as I'm off the Troma bandwagon, and I have been for a little bit at this point, that doesn't negate the fact that they have given money to filmmakers to make movies like Father's Day. And like I think at this point especially, my favorite Troma movies are the ones like Father's Day, Mutant Blast, which we covered on the podcast, things that Troma has gotten involved with on a production basis, and Lloyd saying, "Put me in your movie," and cool, you get your cameo, do your thing over here, but there's still a filmmaker putting their vision through, and as much as it's through the Troma machine, it still works to like speak to their voice.
Josh, you sent over a little bit of recommended reading before today's episode. I feel like this is probably a good place, talking about Troma, talking about Astron 6 and everything, for you to kind of hit on the document that you sent over. And I know you're not going to read it in its entirety, but maybe share some of the highlights here.
Well, I mean, so the thing about, and like Donato was saying, the thing about Troma is if they're going to give you money, then they're, and this is not just Troma, it's the case with any financer or any production house. If they're going to give you money, they want to know what they're getting. And so that goes through script approval. They have to send over, all their stuff. This movie was made for $10,000, which if you watch it is bananas, like that they did all these things with $10,000. But I was able to, I was friendly with some of the Astron 6 guys a while ago when this was doing the festival rounds and in the run up to the home video release. And they were frustrated with Troma because there were some things that were happening behind the scenes that weren't exactly to their benefit. They didn't feel like the film was being promoted the way that it should have been, and managed to get a look at some of the script notes that were sent over for Father's Day, for a very early draft from Troma, and they are just wild. Like the things. If you've seen the film, you know that every 5 seconds there is something just absolutely brutally repulsive happening. Whether it's a needle in a dick, lots of dick violence.
Yeah,
lots of dick violence. There's the offensive caricatures of characters. They are quote unquote characters, but they are just really caricatures of all these people. And the fact that in the script notes, every single thing that you see that happens in Father's Day, the proper final film, is like pulled back. Like it's about 20% as offensive as someone as Troma thought that it could be, and like that's what they were going for. It's crazy to say that a film like Father's Day is a compromised, somewhat compromised version of Astron 6's vision, because for the first time they were working with someone else's money. They made Manborg for $1,000 because they did it all themselves. And to get $10,000 from Troma was a boon because someone's paying us to make a movie that we want to make. But at the same time, there are those weird little things where it's, they have to make sacrifices on what they think the film should be. Because they're now beholden to someone else and beholden to a production house. it was all very messy. And in fact, there is still a trailer for a behind the scenes doc called No Sleep, No Surrender that never actually got released. And apparently now is the story is that it's somewhere stuck on a corrupted hard drive. And so it can't be released because the full edit of it is gone. But even in the trailer, you can see, questionable dealings going on with Troma and the Astron 16. It's not surprising that they didn't go back to Troma to do the editor. I'll say that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting document and makes me again like falling out of love with it. When I was first getting into horror, I like the schlock, the splatter, all that stuff. I still rewatch Poltergeist. Like there still are plenty of trauma movies that I do enjoy, but especially watching something like Shakespeare's Shitstorm, I now clearly see how we got from again the Toxic Avenger to Shakespeare's Shitstorm and the trauma track, and it's like, wow, maybe maybe it's nice not to know the behind the scenes stuff sometimes.
Sometimes, and with Lloyd Kaufman, I could not possibly take away the fact that he's made a tremendous impact on independent cinema in this country. Just from Toxic Avenger forward, Troma's been, on the whole, a force for good in indie cinema and independent horror. But at the same time, like they've created this thing, and there's sort of there's a dichotomy among horror fans, I feel, that's like, do you like Troma films or do you dislike Troma films, like in general? And I find myself firmly on the I'm not really interested in all that side of the fence, and which makes it just crazy to me that this film is still as successful as it is, even with the compromises that had to be made.
Legit real story. I went on a date like 2 months ago at this point, but like that was a point of contention. It was very much like, where do you stand on the Lloyd Kaufman thing? And I was just like, oh, cool. Like that is a true thing.
I feel like that has to be representative of dating in Los Angeles, because I don't feel like that's a first date question that comes up in any other city in America.
Like just starts showing pictures and stuff, and I was just like, oh, you're very pro this. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
This movie was a lot for me. I think that listen, if you listen to the podcast, there are Donato movies and there are Monaco movies, right? And this is definitely a Donato movie. And my wife was coming down the stairs during the opening scene and was like, "What?" And I was like, like I knew what I signed up for. You need to go back upstairs. Take the dog for a walk. I will say that I can appreciate the creativity that is on display for most of the film. The humor got me in a couple of key places. Like there's a line when a character opens a coffin and it's just a bunch of guns, and the twink, who's the other character, says, "I bet you're sad your dad's not in there, huh?" And like I laughed out loud. So like I don't want to downplay that this movie wasn't effective to me. Also, the entire sequence in hell is just like how you do that for a whole movie for $10,000, let alone how you create sort of like this stop motion hellscape for less than that money. There's a lot of incredible creativity on here, but this is the kind of thing that sort of pushes that like, can I enjoy dichotomy here? Because I've seen a lot of films that fall into this, like this kind of orbit, right? I've seen like movies like Thanksgiving and other stuff that are sort of playing with the DIY budget, the exploitation, the like goopiness for the sake of goopiness. And it's not really my cup of tea, but the people that made Thanksgiving also made The Headhunter, which is a fucking incredible film. The Void and some of the other stuff like Psycho Gorman is a really, really. So I think I've always felt that movies like this, like Father's Day, are enjoyable almost on like a metagame level, because you're enjoying the narrative of what you're seeing on the screen, and that's fun. But even if you're not into that, you're aware of the labor of love and the creativity and the effort that's going into it, and you can't help, like, I don't think about I don't know, the Russo brothers when I'm watching like a Marvel movie. I think about the DIY team when I'm watching something like Father's Day, and probably how hard it was to get what ends up on screen. That notion flitters through my head on and off throughout the movie, is like, oh, that must have been a pain in the ass. Oh, like there's a car chase. That whole car chase must have been a fucking pain in the ass, because there's no stuntmen. They're just doing everything at like 15 miles an hour, but you can still get hurt at 50 miles an hour. So that was I wanted to highlight, because I know Donato, we eventually get to a point where we watch something like this, he's like, "Monagle, what did you think?" I wanted to anchor and put it out there that those are the sort of things that I grapple with when I watch something like this. But some of those jokes, they really fucking landed for me.
the whole maple syrup thing in the woods.
Yeah.
It's not a maple tree.
That's
What
a
was I
maple
making
tree.
syrup with? Like those are the little things that work. But I knew coming in what you were when Josh said he's like this. We're doing Father's Day. I was like, oh yeah, no, I can't wait to see Monogle's reaction to this because I had seen it prior a while ago. I hadn't rewatched it, and the rewatch was very much a reminder of like
Mhm.
not a Monocle movie. No, this is great. This is great.
How does this land in your household, Josh? Is this across the board for all y'all?
My wife loves it. I haven't shown my son
Of
because
course.
he may be 18, but no one's old enough for this movie.
Correct.
Um, but yeah, my wife has a very similar taste to mine. So, and this is it's the kind of thing I think a lot of people do, especially horror fans. When you first start dating someone, you have to like put them through, the tests. Like,
Yes.
I'm going to be doing this with my life. Are you going to be able to hang with this? And like this was an early one. A Serbian film was an early one. Like those where you're just kind of like saying, okay, I am this person. Like this person is me who watches these movies on
Right.
purpose, you know. And she's right there with me, which is a lovely thing, and it's a reason we've been happily married for as long as we have. But yeah, this is a favorite in the Hurtado house.
So talk to me how you I guess how you feel, because Donato and I kind of weighing in a little bit. Like, I know from our pre-conversation that this is kind of sounds like it's right up your jam. The darkest corners of the internet brought to life on screen kind of vibes. But I can imagine you probably had the opportunity to introduce this movie to a lot of people over the years. I'm kind of curious how it's played with folks that are more like us, that are not like us, because this is the kind of thing where like I almost want to make people watch it just so that I can spend the entire movie looking at them, right? And like, no, exactly as you described with your wife. Like, are we still cool after this? Did I learn something about you? Did you learn something about me?
Yeah, I mean, I recommend it all the time because I love it so much. But at the same, you really have to understand. This is again the programmer me coming out. You have to understand your audience. You have to know, because I don't want to recommend something that someone's gonna have a bad time with. Like that's not fun for me.
Sure.
I want people to enjoy it, and I know that there's like I'm not going to recommend this to my parents. Like I'll recommend a lot of things to them, but or my little sister or something like that. But people who are fans of this type of film, um, and there are lots of us. I absolutely recommend. Um, One thing that I've been fortunate to grow as a sort of community around myself with the Fantastic Fest team, some of whom are no longer there, but they've been there for a long time, is that those guys are truly passionate about films from all levels, like at every budget level, from something like this that cost $10,000 up to big multi-million dollar movies, things that have disappeared into the ether. I was talking to Donato about one of the alternate choices that I was thinking about as a little Italian movie from 2000 that I don't think ever got an actual release at all. It ended up like on a Shriek Show DVD back in the day. It's called The Mummy Theme Park. But there are just a ton of films out there that no one's giving an opportunity to. No one has been given the opportunity to discover.
Mm-hmm.
And this film is currently streaming on Tubi, which is the home of all things wonderful. Like Tubi is a boon to the universe,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also really hard to find stuff on Tubi. It's got the same kind of algorithm thing going where once you watch one thing, it'll show you a bunch of other stuff that you might also enjoy. I go on Tubi pretty much every Saturday morning to start my weekend. I go up, have a cup of coffee, and put something trashy on Tubi. And Father's Day has never come up my lists, which is crazy because I watch all kind of stuff that is a lot like Father's Day. And I think, it's not part of that sort of curated collection that people need to have in order to really give a film a rebirth or, that kind of thing.
Well, let me ask you a smart question about that then. Because I think we can locate this as sort of like, or at least the early days of Astron 6, we talked about like the trends and where it fit within like resurgence of DIY exploitation. Do you get the sense that there is that when you're thinking about horror fans, when you think about the community, it almost feels like we did that and it felt kind of like a blip or an aberration, right? Like things like Tire or Hobo with a Shotgun, this kind of mode of films. it doesn't seem like something that we have, as horror fans, sort of stood by. I don't know how to articulate it any better, right? Like it just sort of seemed like it was like, oh, we did that for a couple of years and then we're done with it, right? So do you think that makes it harder to sort of? We're always talking about like the idea of new canons on the podcast because that's the only way that any of this stuff ever gets discovered is if it ends up in some sort of formal or informal canon. When you think about like exploitation 80s type cinema, do you think that we're just sort of like, I don't want to say embarrassed is a strong word, but do you sort of like, is it all sort of like, yeah, we had like a minute there where that's all we want to do and we're over it? Does it make it harder for you to try and like elevate this and bring this into other conversations? Does it feel so much locked into like we spent 5 years making every ridiculous movie that we could think of and then we're done and we got that out of our system?
I mean, I think that there's still something of that sort of bubbling under the surface. If you look at the works of like let's say Begas, Joe Begas, right? That's sort of on the same level. Like it's the same kind of vibe. You know, your Christmas Bloody Christmas, Bliss, that kind of stuff is in the same ballpark as something like Father's Day. But what I think a big concern, and this is very important, that Father's Day is not a politically correct film, and these days it would be torn to shreds if it were a new release. It's only sort of in retrospect that yeah, there's a lot of really bad jokes and really bad taste. Um, but I don't know that it would be like something that a film festival would select now, because you're trying to put your best foot forward. You're trying to show where cinema is going. Like that's kind of the idea. And trying to have like that kind of discussion about a film like Father's Day, which is, there are homophobic jokes. There's all kinds of things in there that, wouldn't pass muster nowadays. Makes it a bit of a challenge to like publicly come out and champion, like I'm doing now, and put forth as like, this is something that should be, canonized, this type of film. No matter how much I love it, like I understand and see that it's gonna piss a lot of people off, so it's a tough one.
Yeah, and I mean, like, maybe an unpopular opinion here as well, but like part of the idea that like, yeah, like I own Rubber. Like you're talking about Rubber, right,
Yeah,
Monocle?
sorry, I
Yeah,
said
no,
Tire,
no.
but Rubber was the movie. Yeah, yeah,
But like exactly, like I own Rubber. Like I love that film and I have tried to champion it a bunch, but I think there is less of a degree that we believe of horror fans, let's say, of discovering new stuff versus watching the same things over and over again. And that's not a judgment. Like we like our comfort. People just want to watch the Halloween movies over and over again, the Friday 13th movies over and over again. But like I have noticed over the years of doing this, like going to film festivals and finding these little movies and tweeting about them and talking about them, those are the tweets that get like the least engagement from me. And statistically before Twitter died and all that shit, when people actually did engage and stuff like that. Like
yeah. Before
there,
we all went to Spoutable or Blue Sky,
right, or Blue
or
Sky or
whatever.
whatever.
Yeah, like whatever the flavor. By the time this episode is released, it'll be something else.
But yeah, like there was this thing where like I would see people tweet out like, oh my god, like there's so many indie movies that don't get discovered, blah blah blah. Like we need to talk about those. And then like it's just me in the corner and like other people, obviously not just me. It is a large collection of us, but us in the corner going like, hey, here's that movie that you want me to recommend. I'm doing it. Here it is. And then like a year later, that same person's like, oh my god, I just watched this movie. No one was talking about it. And I'm like, okay, so we're kind of just talking in circles here. Like I don't really, I don't know. It's a hard thing to kind of judge of like, is there a larger market for these more obscure, smaller movies than we believe? Or is it us just going out and discovering them and then they just keep doing what they're doing because the interest isn't as largely there as we believe it is?
I do wonder too if the fandom is evolving a little bit, right? Because like I think of, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, either listeners or the people on the call, but I think of us as a pretty progressive group of film critics that are aware not only of the context a film is released in, but also how it should be received today, right? Like we do nuanced readings, just as you did, Josh, about like, yes, this is important because of this, but also when we read it through a contemporary lens, we should be aware of X, Y, and Z. Like nuanced readings are, not everything exists in the past or the present. It exists in both places simultaneously. But I also feel like a movie like Father's Day is naturally going to probably appeal to an audience that isn't going to be as, and this is a gross oversimplification. I don't mean to do it, but like, what it offers in terms of just excess is probably more appealing to people who like and respond to movies that are just excessive. And that's always a bit of a negotiated reading, right? Because like, if you index too hard on like New York City exploitation horror from like the 70s and 80s, I don't want to say that says anything about you, but if that's kind of where you go to again and again, then the kind of stuff that we want to champion now, that's different stuff, or even SOVAM that we talked about in our last episode, which is a different type of exploitation film. You might not approach those in the same way. So it's an interesting also like sort of self-selection. I feel like we're talking a lot about the reception of the movie and not itself, but I think it's one of those, like, it does what it says on the tin, right? Like, if you're going to enjoy this movie based on a photo, any fucking screenshot from this movie is going to tell you anything that you need to know about it. And so I think it's interesting to think about who responds to that, who reacts to that, and why.
Oh, absolutely. With Father's Day, it is a film that, in spite of my reservations about the company, it is for a trauma audience. Like, that's the kind of people that are going to appreciate the film on a base level. And one of the things that I find challenging about horror and the quote unquote horror community is that community is a real strong word. Like, it's loose knit at best. And there are, for every well-read, thinking man's critic that is approaching horror from that perspective, there are a bunch of people living under rocks in their mom's basements, watching just the worst trash that you could possibly think of. And I like to think there's room for both. I don't necessarily want to align myself with that type of film fan, because while I might appreciate it and enjoy it, it's one of those things I feel bad because I'm like, you're liking this the wrong way. Like, you like this thing, I like this thing, but I see this thing and I see what it is and I see what it does. And there are, anytime you go to a horror convention, it's always readily apparent that, maybe I'm just not like these people, which is fine by me, but it's the kind of thing where I love the film, and I wish that Astron 6 were still together doing active work, but you can't make a living making $10,000 movies with 5 guys. That's not realistic. And so that's why Kostanski is now like a successful director. Jared Big Gillespie is also working in art. Those 2 guys are probably the most consistently working, and they're behind the scenes guys. I honestly, rewatching this today, found myself actually pretty impressed with the performances.
Yeah.
Adam Brooks, who plays Ahab, is a legitimately good actor. And he was the father in PG also. And there are moments where he's not trying to sell a joke. When he's talking about his sister, and how much he loves her, in a different way later on. But like, those are good dramatic performances. Like, he puts in good work. Connor Sweeney is just funny as hell. He's always up for that joke. The dad in the coffin joke was a particularly good moment for him. But I just find myself wishing that this film is one specific type of film from them. If you go back and look at the shorts that they made, they're all over the place. There's beach comedies. There's more of this stop motion stuff. There's straight up grindhouse with no humor in some of those early shorts. They're not a horror collective, which I think is something that they've kind of been pigeonholed into. It's just that that's a way. It's the best way for them to utilize all of their unique skills. With Kostanski being the stop motion whiz and the effects genius that he is, you can go back and look at if you go back because I went back and watched all the shorts that are available, and you can tell which ones are Kostanski specials. And this is something that one of my fellow programmers at Fantastic Fest, Peter Kaplowski, who also does the midnight section at Midnight Madness at Toronto, he's been banging the drum for Astron 6 since Laser Ghost. He's an executive producer on a couple of their films. On Manborg, he's an executive producer, and you know, it's. I wish that there were a way for them to, maybe just like get the band back together and do another big sort of thing and make it maybe not horror. Like the editor is fine. It's probably my least favorite of their works, um, but like give them the opportunity to do something, where they can all come back together for a decent paycheck because they do have lives to live, and they have kids and families and all this stuff now that they didn't have, maybe 15 years ago when they started. Um, I want the world to think about Astron 6. That's kind of where I come down on this.
I mean, and again, it is spectacular as a special effects showcase with no money and what you can pull off. And we're talking about Deadstream. Like again, like think about something like Deadstream and think about what that collective did, the Winters, what they did going into the VHS segment they did, and there is so much parallel there of making a universe and making something out of literally nothing. Like let's talk about styrofoam and green screens and junkyard, props and things of that nature. And to pull that off and make a movie out of that to me is just again like so impressive. If we're talking about Father's Day, like we are talking about stuff like Hobo with a Shotgun or things of that level, like that is the kind of grindhouse homage. And that is where, like again, I totally understand why people would not want to watch this movie. It comes with a trigger warning, and that is not like making fun of it at all. It is absolutely correct. And if it is not your style, it's not your style. But it like at the end of the day, like it is a very good satire of grindhouse cinema. Like what it's doing is putting out what's been put out already. It is trying to do a commentary on it. I do believe there is a version of this movie that isn't produced by Troma that I think is better, and that is not me even saying fuck Troma, like not at all. I'm just knowing what they lean into and knowing what they probably support did not benefit the film in certain aspects. And getting past that though, it is just fun to watch. The practical is so good. The way that it doesn't shy away from again male nudity in a genre that 100% has shied away from male nudity and supported another one, there's a lot to comment on there, and that's all the good stuff about it. But it's a hard recommend. It's a hard one to go out there and be like, everyone watch Father's Day. So like that's where the hard selling point is, because I feel like we've been talking about just the point of history in which it came out and why it wasn't received and stuff of that nature. But this is a movie at the end of the day, and I do think the performances are very good. I love Adam Brooks.
Yeah.
I think Adam Brooks is great across the board. Even in, I agree with the editor, it's probably my least Astron 6 favorite, but Adam Brooks sells the hell out of it. And so if I'm going to sign up for, an exploitation not mockumentary, but like an exploitation satire, an exploitation comedy that is playing with this genre, yeah, I'm not going to shy away from Father's Day because I know what I'm getting into. And that's the big thing. Just know what you're getting into with one of these.
Yeah. Yeah, I honestly thought it was Justin Benson for like a minute, and I knew it wasn't, but there were times where I was like, he's really good. He looks like Justin Benson. It's not Justin Benson, but yeah, the performance is really good. There's so much more we could talk about the film. I would love to talk about the, when it switches to found footage inexplicably about 2/3 of the way through. I would love to talk about the fact that like the least likely movie that I've ever seen to fucking pull sound cues from, the Mission, Ennio Morricone score from the Mission, which is like the most wild decision for a $10,000 budget. That's probably where all of that budget went, was just on licensing rights and the bad MIDI cover. There's so much we could say. I recognize that we're kind of at the end of our time here. So our last question that we would normally ask our guests, Josh, is, what do you think this movie needs to do to be rediscovered, to be unforgotten? And I'm going to vamp as hard as you want. You want to do like a short little diatribe on a piece of the film we haven't had an opportunity to talk about, I encourage you to do that, because I want everybody to be able to like highlight and talk about the thing that they liked, because I know the conversation took us away from some of the practical stuff that we might have talked about. I still think it was a worthwhile place to go, but I don't want to lose sight of like those elements that really catch our eye. So where do you think this movie finds its future, Josh, and how does it get there?
Well, I do in the sense that I'm going to vamp for just a moment here.
Yes.
It's a very, very cleverly written film. And that's one thing that I don't think, because there's so much visually happening throughout the film in terms of effects, in terms of or even orally with the music, the synth score in this thing is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
And there's just I don't think it gets the appreciation for being as cleverly written as it is, you know. The fact that they named the guy Ahab and he's chasing his white whale. Like all these things come in that you don't necessarily think about as it's happening because, well, like I said, that guy just sliced his dick in half and he's chewing on someone else's here in a minute. And all these dads are getting raped. Like there's all these things happening that it's tough to like slow it down and pick out those moments that are just solid, you know. And the fact that this movie just does everything. Like it does everything. And in the last 10 minutes when they're in hell and it just all of a sudden becomes this giant stop motion showcase, is just it's wonderful and it makes no sense. And then the final shot right before the credits where we see what has happened to the three lead characters as they tried to save the world from, you know, the fuck Manicus demon, is just the icing on the cake. It's just so much fun. And I kind of feel bad for loving it as much as I do, but I don't feel bad at all because it's fucking great. Um, I do think that this would need to be, you know, I don't see why this is not playing, you know, more sort of Midnighter things, Terror Tuesday sort of things, that kind of thing. Maybe it's too new. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not quite old enough to be rediscovered or revisited. Because I've had that issue before when doing retrospective stuff. Is like, oh well, this film is only 10 years old or only 7 years old or whatever the case may be, and so it's not quite a retro yet. You know, does it need to be part of a curated collection on Shudder? You know, I think it's been on Shudder here. I know it's been on Shudder overseas. It's not on Shudder now. But if it were part of a curated collection of those kind of films, like you were saying, you know, with a Shotgun, another film that I love dearly, that is just mean as shit. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe Joe Bob Briggs. I mean, hell, there's so much nudity in this. That's right up his alley. You know, this is a Joe Bob Briggs movie through and through. You know, I think that's what it's going to take. You know, and I hope that it gets that kind of appreciation, and I hope, you know, that if that sort of thing happens, it happens collectively to the Astron 6 oeuvre. Like I believe that there's a lot there. You know, the shorts are all fantastic, and I don't think enough people have seen most of them to see the sort of range that those guys had. And the features that they've made have all been in this sort of horror vein. Like I said, Manborg is horror-ish. Editors Giallo, but that's just because that's the best way, like I said, to utilize the talents of the individuals. But if you go back and look, you know, they've got a Hard Bodies spoof in Cool Guys, which is fantastic. They've got, you know, Punch Out, which is about this guy who just loves getting punched in the face and like tries to get everyone to punch him in the face the whole time. You know, Laser Ghost 2, which we mentioned before, which, you know, one of my favorite gags in Laser Ghost, which you can go find on YouTube, is the fact that laser is spelled two different ways in the title, once with a Z and once with an S, which I find absolutely fucking hilarious. You know, you've got Divorced Dad, which is their cable access YouTube series, which got partially banned from YouTube because they had an episode called Mysis that was about that they thought was an ISIS tool or something like that. You know, the people who know, like, but I think that there are more people out there that would be, you know, appreciative of what Astron 6 and the guys behind that team had to offer. So put together a whole collection, like do a whole Shudder channel of Astron 6, just running 24 hours a day.
Donata?
Yeah, so I'm going to go the route of, we talk about Canucksploitation, the Canadian, you know, exploitation genre, and we talk about it in terms of the earlier days, My Bloody Valentine, Black Christmas, things of that nature, the movies that started it. But I feel like we should do an update. I feel like there should be a collection of newer films that definitely fit that vibe. And I think, you know, do Father's Day, do Lowell Dean's Wolf Cop, do Jason Eisner's Hobo with a Shotgun. Like, there are so many movies out there that are keeping that classification alive that, you know, I think someone else referred to it as like Maple Syrup Massacre kind of movies. Like, Canadian exploitation is insane at times. And if you really do want to find a way to bring Father's Day back and find a way to get it in front of theaters again, and I think that's a great little bill to do. And there's a few more movies out there, like there Jesse Cook, I believe, is somebody else out there, like doing movies like Monster Brawl and other weirdo Canadian horror films. So there are so many newer films to pick from that you can do a Canadian exploitation retrospective for. And I think that would be a great way to do exactly what Josh is saying as well. Like bring some of these Astron movies back. Like let's shine a light on the new crop. Because again, as horror film critics and people who go to festivals, conversations always skew towards the old. As much as we want to talk about the new, as much as we want to talk about what's happening now, conversations always go back to the Fridays, the Chuckies, the things of that nature. And I mean, do I always jump into a Chucky conversation? Of course, yeah, I'm not going to not do that. But it'd be cool to start talking about the new. And, you know, that's what we do. We try to talk about the new. We try to get that in front of new audiences. So maybe that's one more way of doing it. You know, find a way to put those movies together and do a night of, whether it's Shutter or whether it's a even just a local screening somewhere. Pick, even if one more person finds this movie, it's a success.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what you said, Josh, because that feels right to me. I think it's too new, and I think it's specifically too new in the context of its vamping on a mode of cinema that still, or at least has been for the past few years, still very popular. 80s nostalgia is starting to die down because nostalgia works on a 30-year cycle. So we're getting into the 90s. We're starting to see movies that are openly playing with concepts and visuals and ideas from the mid to late 90s now. But, you know, a lot of people are still like in that 80s horror mentality. And so a more contemporary film that is riffing on a movie that is still in flavor, it needs a little bit of that distance. Probably in 20 years, it'll be interesting to see if people are familiar with something like Father's Day, but don't know the movies necessarily that it's ripping on or riffing. If like that little bit of distance kind of gives this primacy in our look back at genre cinema. And for my own vamping, I want to give a shout out to Matthew Kennedy as Father John Sullivan in this film. Josh, you were talking about performances. He has maybe my two favorite scenes in the film, which is pulling a gun in heaven to blackmail his way into hell, and also shouting at a resurrecting character to get an abortion so that she doesn't come back with the spawn of Satan. It's just like the ex-Catholic in me. Love that shit. Like all the religious stuff in this movie, absolute slam dunk for the ex-Catholic in me, and I was very, very happy with that. So there we have it. That is how you go see this film. This is how you go see more movies like this. This is where we figured it out. So when eventually they do the Criterion release of Father's Day, I'm going to recommend Josh Hurtado write the essay. You heard it here first. Make it happen.
Let's do it.
Josh, I want to say thank you so much for coming on for this episode. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about anything that might be in the pipeline here at the end, too. So if you've got things happening, how do people follow you on social media? How do they stay on top of recommendations you might have?
You can follow me everywhere. Yeah. Letterboxd, Instagram, Twitter, all at Hateful Josh, a name I chose a very long time ago, and I'm trying to distance myself from, but it's better than one I had before that. For lots of movie recommendations, bold opinions, not as much hate as there used to be, but unless it's political, in which case I hate a lot of people.
Sure.
Living in Texas, it's a hazard. You can also follow Potentate Films on Twitter for updates on screenings that we're a part of right now. I am working on touring retrospective of Rajamouli's work. We're doing it a little bit at a time, but it's going to start picking up here in the next couple of months. So people will want to know when they can go see Ega on the big screen, because that is a treat. So that's pretty much it. Those are the places you can find me.
Excellent. Donato, what social platforms do people look for you on these days?
Pretty much sticking to the core at this point. As you said, Monagle, I feel like there's a new one every day, and as much as I sign up for them, I never use them again. So once we figure out if Twitter will ever die and we pick a new one, I will pick a new one. But until then, you can follow me at Donato Bomb on Twitter, Letterboxd, and Instagram. As always, you're going to see my articles, IGN, Slash Film, Play Disgusting, Fangoria, down the list. Whatever I do, I'll tweet it out. That's all I got for you this time.
Awesome. You can follow me at Matt Monagle on Twitter until the bitter fucking end. I would encourage you to check out, if you haven't already, I'm sure you have, but check out www.certifiedforgotten.com to see some of the really cool essays that we've published, thoughts about some of the films that, if you like our episodes, are going to be right in line with the kind of things you're going to want to learn more about. And we, as of recently, are now on Letterboxd as an HQ. So we're trying to make sure we update each of the movies that we talk about on the podcast and each of the films that are featured on the website. We're updating with a little bit of content there. So if Letterboxd is your trustworthy place for film information, it used to be one of the nicest things about Twitter is you would just insert, a movie title and then switch to filter by follows and see all the people that were talking about this movie you just watched. Much less reliable than it used to be. So if you're on Letterboxd, in addition to these fine gentlemen, do also check out Certified Forgotten because we're there too.
Also, if you like the podcast, like and comment. We don't do that enough. We need to be better at promoting ourselves. And we like
Yes.
the comments we've been getting have been very nice. So we need to remind the people, if you do like us, comments go a huge way. And we appreciate everyone who has. And if you have not, why not? Give just 5 minutes, you know?
We don't have a tug of ego, but more than 2 reviews a year would be kind of cool. Let's cross that threshold. That would be neat, just for us. Do it for Matt's. That's all we have to ask. Josh, you'll be back because I'm going to make you come back because I'm going to make you pick an Indian film to talk about, one of the ones that might have been in there, because I really want to learn from you. So basically, I just want to like put the spotlight on you and let you go. But thank you so much for joining us this week. Thanks for giving us Father's Day. It was the dumbest movie with the best conversation, which I feel like is always a slam dunk for us. So thanks so much, bud.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Donato, take us off.
Maybe now you'll take me seriously.
This is so stupid.